This is the headwaters of the mighty Yukon River, fifth largest river in this hemisphere, the largest river that empties into the Pacific. It flows 1,400 miles to the Bering Sea. Whether by boat when it was open or by dog sled when it was frozen, the Yukon was the most direct and only practical route to the interior of Alaska and northwestern Canada. These means were adequate for the handful of trappers, prospectors, and traders in the territory, but only a railroad could handle a full-fledged stampede for gold. In the year 1898, in the middle of a gold rush, in the middle of a frenzy of excitement, in the middle of a northern winter, construction of a unique railroad began. It was built with English money and Canadian engineering and mostly American labor. The White Pass and Yukon route was a bold international undertaking. This historic narrow gauge railroad, one of the last working railroads in North America, still has an international flavor. And the White Pass and Yukon Railroad still carries excited, eager passengers on a ride into the past. In the late 1700s, the Russian-American company, with outposts stretching from California to the Yukon River, began to whisper of gold in the north. But even whispers were silenced by the Tsar, lest the fur traders be drawn away from the harvest of fur seals and otters. In the 1800s, whispers of gold drew American adventurers west and north. First California, then Colorado, then British Columbia, and finally to Robert Service's land where the mountains are nameless and the rivers all run God knows where. By the turn of the century, the whispers had become a lusty shout, echoing down the valley, across the broad plain and through the blood of all restless men ground down in the numbing depression that followed the Panic of '93. George Carmack, a Californian, cleaning utensils used in butchering a moose, scooped up a pan of gravel containing $4 worth of placer gold from a small creek that drained into the Klondike River. Carmack and his two Indian companions hastened to 40 Mile Creek and the closest recording office. There, on the bar of McPhee's Saloon, in front of goggle-eyed miners who were barely eking out a living on 10-cent pans, he poured spent rifle cartridges filled with gold from Bonanza Creek. Moccasin telegraph carried word of Carmack's discovery up and down the river. The 700 or so men who were already in the north rushed to the scene and staked every inch of every tributary stream of the Klondike River. Even after they froze solid, they continued working feverishly through the long northern winter, grubbing out nuggets of gold that lay like cheese in a sandwich between flaky slabs of rock. The following June, when ice went out of the Yukon River, they took a small trading company steamer 1,700 miles downstream to St. Michael's, where they boarded the Excelsior and the Portland, two ocean-going steamers. July 17, 1897, nearly a year after the discovery claims were staked, the Portland docked in Seattle carrying nearly 2 tons of gold. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Gold! Gold! Gold!" Ears perked up and depressed spirits soared. Men left their plows in the furrows and their wives to run the farms. They mortgaged property and belabored relatives for loans. They left their jobs. Even the mayor of Seattle resigned and headed for the gold fields. Women, too, stricken by gold fever, rushed north with hopeful hearts and a greedy glitter in their eyes. The most direct route to the gold fields lay 1,000 miles up the Inside Passage to the port of either Skagway or Dyea. Skagway had a deep-water port and already rudimentary beginnings of a dock. Dyea had no natural port, but before the end of the rush, there were docks built that extended nearly 2 miles across the shallow tidal flats. Then came a tortuous portage over the Coast Range Mountains. Once over the mountains at Lake Lindeman or Lake Bennett, they cut down green trees and whipsawed lumber and built boats. There were still 600 miles of lakes and rivers to float before they reached the gold fields, and the river system was interspersed with 5 separate sets of rapids. Although the Chilkoot Pass from Dyea was higher and steeper, the final half-mile was a 45-degree climb. Most stampeders chose this 33-mile route. However, a second pass through the mountains existed. Discovered in 1887 by Captain William Moore, the White Pass was thought by many of the stampeders to be the better route. The White Pass was more than 10 miles longer than the Chilkoot, but as it was also nearly 1,000 feet lower and more gradual, they thought it suitable for pack animals. This proved to be a cruel deception. The opening of the White Pass as a summer trail was not a blunder, it was a crime, commented one observer. There was a biting horror on the White Pass Trail as 3,000 pack horses were driven to their deaths. Jack London witnessed the carnage at its height in 1897 and described it in these unforgettable words. The horses died like mosquitoes in the first frost, and from Skagway to Bennett, they rotted in heaps. They died at the rocks, they were poisoned at the summit, and they starved at the lakes. They fell off the trail, what there was of it, and they went through it. In the river, they drowned under their loads or were dashed to pieces against the boulders. They snapped their legs in the crevices, and they broke their backs, falling backward with their packs. In the sloughs, they sank from fright or were smothered in the slime, and they were disemboweled in the bogs where the corduroyed logs turned end up in the mud. Men shot them, worked them to death, and when they were gone, went back to the beach and bought more. Some did not bother to shoot them, stripping the saddles off and the shoes and leaving them where they fell. Their hearts turned to stone, those which did not break, and they became beasts, the men on the dead horse trail. Tappan Adney, the Harper's correspondent, added a sad epitaph. When the suns and rains of summer shall have melted the snows of the Chilkoot, the White Pass will be paved with the bones of horses, and the ravens and foxes will have feasted as never until the white man sought a new way across the great mountain. As many horses as have gone in alive, just so many will bleach their bones beside the pine trees and in the gulches, for none will come out. By September 1897, all movement ceased on the White Pass Trail. The rocky ledges were choked with the decaying bodies of the thousands of dead horses, and the low sections of the trail had been churned into a sea of mud. In November of 1897, George Brackett, an ex-mayor of Minneapolis, set out to build the Brackett Wagon Road over the White Pass. At first, the toll road was a great success. The stampeders were grateful for an improvement over the horrors of the dead horse trail. But as excitement mounted, they broke down the toll gates and when winter came, went around over the frozen river. When Skagway's founder, William Moore, first discovered the White Pass in 1887, he was predicting even then that a wagon road could be built and maybe, just maybe, even a railroad. Moore's dream began to take substance in April of 1898 with a meeting between two men in the fast-growing boomtown of Skagway. Sir Thomas Tancred, representing the English financial house of Close Brothers, and a young Irish-Canadian contractor, Michael J. Henney. Close Brothers provided the money and Mike Henney the expertise to push a rail line over the mountains through wild, untamed territory. 5 separate surveys were taken, all of them on foot. Something from each of these surveys went into the selection of the final route. Years later, when modern aerial surveys were made, modern engineers with all their fancy equipment agreed that no finer route could possibly have been chosen than that made on the basis of those 5-foot surveys, all of them in the winter. So that Close Brothers in London would know how their money was being spent, H.C. Barley was hired to be the official photographer. Materials arrived on May 27, 1899, and work began the next day. The first thing that they did was lay the tracks down Broadway. The freight tracks were placed along the mountainside where the freight tracks go today. The depot was built between September and December of 1898. It was very hastily constructed and just built by the railroad men. Initially, some of the interior walls were made of packing cases and insulation was sawdust. The administration building was built in 1900. By this time, things had calmed down a bit, and the administration building was designed by an architect, Henry Dozier of Seattle. It was the building of the railroad that gave a sense of permanency to the young city of Skagway, and businessmen who were here even in 1898 realized that thanks to the railroad and the deep-water port, Skagway would survive and not turn into a ghost town. The entire roadbed had to be cleared and the work was done by hand. Most of the workmen were hired on the spot in Skagway. They were stampeders detained for one reason or another, either waiting for a partner to arrive, or waiting for the rest of their outfits, or just waiting for spring and the ice to go out on the lakes. They were happy to work for 30 cents an hour for a 10-hour day, top wages in those days. Mess tents were set up along the right-of-way and workers paid $1 a day for board and room. Otherwise, all of their funds were likely to have been squandered in the saloons and dance halls of Skagway. For the most part, the railroad workers were superior to ordinary labor gangs in both intelligence and education. Great numbers of professional men followed the stampede north, doctors, lawyers, artists, men unused to hard physical labor, yet they built a railroad. If they had an accident and needed a doctor, they simply put out a call. Somewhere, a doctor would lay down his pick and shovel, take out his medical kit, and repair the injured workman, send him back to work, and then go back to work himself. The White Pass and Yukon route maintained hospital facilities also, first in a tent and then later in a proper frame building. 35 lives were lost building the railroad, and that figure includes those who died from pneumonia and other natural causes. Large numbers of horses were also employed. Contrary to the way the stampeders had treated the horses, the railroad treated the horses very well, and blacksmith stations were positioned along the line. Bill Robinson, in charge of the horses, felt you could not work a horse too hard or feed him too much. Mike Henney, the contractor, had one very strict rule: no liquor in camp. Yet Soapy Smith, the con man who controlled Skagway, set up a drinking and gambling tent near Mile 4. They refused to move on when asked by the railroad men. Hugh Foy, foreman of the first section, solved the problem by blasting a piece of the mountain down onto Soapy's drinking and gambling tent. He set the charge at 5 in the morning and gave Soapy's men just enough warning to clear out of the way. They were last seen running down the grade in their long underwear, cussing a blue streak. As might be expected, a great deal of blasting took place. In August of 1898, a 100-ton granite boulder fell on 2 workmen. No effort was made to remove it. As Michael Henney said, no workman could expect a finer monument than that. All told, over 450 tons of black powder and dynamite were used, most of it on the steep, rocky face near the summit. Men worked roped to the granite cliffs. Holes to receive the blasting powder were driven by hand, using a process called double jacking. One man held the bit and two others, in an alternating cadence, struck it with mauls. After each blow, the bit was turned a quarter turn by the holder. Only one tunnel was built in 1898, a 250-foot tunnel at 16 Mile. As they blasted, all of the blasting debris was wheelbarrowed out of the mouth of the tunnel by hand. They built lots of bridges. Railroad bridges have an alpha designation dependent on where they fall after the milepost. For example, the first bridge after the 15-mile post would be 15A, the second would be 15B, and thus the third would be 15C. Once they got above timberline, all of the ballast material had to be moved by hand from the gravelly river valley below. The largest bridge built was a steel cantilever bridge at mile 18. 18A bridge was not completed until 1901. Prior to that time, the train simply went a little further up the canyon, using a smaller wooden trestle and a European-style switchback and turntable to get around the corner. At the time of completion in 1901, 18A bridge was the highest cantilevered bridge in the world. The first train ran on July 20, 1898, just 2 months after construction began. 2 second-hand Brooks engines were purchased from the Columbia and Puget Sound Railroad near Seattle. They arrived on a barge, were winched onto the rails, and pulled a work train that very day. The next day, an excursion train carrying sightseers chugged 4 miles out of Skagway. A large portion of the construction costs were recovered by taking men and equipment as far as the rails went and charging accordingly. Steel reached the summit on February 16, 1899, and the first excursion train ran on February 19, 1899. Sadly, Hugh Foy, who was foreman of that first section, died within a week of pneumonia. Once they reached the summit, the Canadian Mounties refused to allow the railroad to cross into what was considered to be Canadian territory. Proper clearance papers had not yet arrived from Ottawa. Mike Henney could not wait for such niceties as paperwork. He sent his right-hand man, Stickine Bill Robinson, to the summit with a little persuasion for the Mounties, a box of cigars and a case of scotch. When the Mounties woke up the next morning, it was to the ringing of ties 65 feet high. The steepest grade on the Skagway side of the summit is 3.9%, and the steepest grade on the entire railroad is the hill just outside of Whitehorse at 4.2%. The White Pass and Yukon route was completed and the last spike driven at Carcross on July 29, 1900. It had taken just 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days to construct 110 miles of narrow gauge railroad from Tidewater over the Coast Range of mountains. Construction cost totaled $10 million, and an additional $2 million was spent on rolling stock. most of which was purchased second-hand. After the rails were in place between Skagway and Whitehorse, the White Pass and Yukon route began operating a fleet of shallow-draft stern-wheelers that churned the last 460 miles to Dawson City. This important new transportation system, which began with a handshake around a pot-bellied stove in an overnight boomtown, was more than just a heroic undertaking. It was a major key in the opening of the North for industry and settlement. Dredges soon replaced hand mining methods, and even today, gold remains a cornerstone of the economy of the northern Yukon Territory. During World War II, White Pass and Yukon route continued to make history. The threat of a Japanese invasion made overland access between the continental United States and Alaska imperative. To supply the Army engineers building the Alcan Highway, trains loaded with supplies ran around the clock. From 1942 until July of 1946, the railroad was leased to the American Army, and trains were crewed by the 770th Railway Operating Battalion of the Military Transportation Corps. In August of 1943, during one 24-hour period, 3,446 gross tons of freight were carried over the mountains. In memory of those hectic years, Engine 195 stands permanently outside Skagway's City Hall. She was built meter gauge for service in Iran, but was diverted to Skagway and converted to narrow gauge. Keeping the line open in winter took a really concentrated effort. As much as 500 inches of snow could fall in a single season on the summit of the White Pass, and overnight, drifts could form 20 feet deep. Initially, they kept the line open with rotary snowplows. These rotaries cut a cleft 12 feet deep in the snow. If the drifts were deeper than that, and they often were, they would have to be shoveled by hand to a depth of 12 feet before the rotary could proceed. All of the steam power that the rotary could produce was needed just to turn the huge blades. The rotary was propelled forward by 2 steam pusher engines. An entire rotary crew consisted of 10 men, an engineer and a fireman in each of the 3 steam engines, a conductor and 2 brakemen, plus a rotary pilot who rode in the rotary unit and through a very small front window kept track of the progress. With whistle signals, he instructed the engineers in the 2 pusher engines to push the rotary forward or pull it backward so that it could be thrust ahead for another bite. The only communication between these 3 steam engines was whistle signals. The company needed a way to push the snow back further from the tracks and to keep the sidings clear of snow. In 1960, they began to experiment with bulldozers, caterpillars. We just call them cats. Both cats and rotaries were used until 1962 when a snowstorm rolled in from the Pacific that closed the railroad. Wind-blown drifts held 2 rotaries fast at the summit. They could go neither forward nor backward. At the bottom of the hill, a freight train waited. It was loaded with perishables for Whitehorse that had arrived in Skagway on a freighter. In Whitehorse, Skagway's basketball team was stranded. Trains needed to get rolling. In a desperate gamble, they dispatched the cat operator from Glacier Station at mile 14 to make a run to the summit and see if he could free the rotaries and help get the tracks cleared. The cat left Glacier shortly before midnight. The lights were not working on the old 8, so the cat operator took with him a flagman who rode the blade and with a flashlight directed the cat operator whether to turn right or go left. By 6 the next morning, they reached the summit and crossed 16A Bridge. 2 men alone in a blizzard, each with absolute trust in the other. However, it was still to be 2 days before the trains rolled again. Once they learned that the cats could indeed negotiate the high bridges, the White Pass and Yukon route began to make plans to retire the rotary fleet and use cats entirely. Steam engines continued to be used as pusher or helper units in the longer freight trains, and steam was used in passenger service until the mid-1960s. 70 years after the discovery of gold in the Yukon, mining once again boomed in the north, and White Pass and Yukon route played a major role. A large deposit of lead and zinc was discovered in the Anvil Mountains north of Whitehorse. Immediately, a mine was developed by a Greek corporation, Cyprus Anvil, and the White Pass and Yukon route began a major improvement program to get ready to bring the ore concentrates from a railhead near Whitehorse to Tidewater. The old snow sheds, not so necessary now that cats were used instead of rotaries, were torn down. Many of the smaller wooden trestle bridges were filled in and converted to solid roadbed, with culverts to carry the rushing spring freshets. Some of the larger wooden trestles were converted to steel. Heavier 85-pound rail was laid, and the entire roadbed reballasted. Closure of all the Yukon mines during the economic recession in 1982 forced the White Pass and Yukon to cease operations. The brave little railroad that had run with only minor temporary stoppages since 1900 was brought to a halt. But not for long. An increase in tourism and enthusiastic support from both government and the citizens of Whitehorse and Skagway made passenger service a reality. Engine number 73, the only steam engine still owned by the White Pass and Yukon route, is fully restored and once more sending clouds of steam skyward as she escorts excited passengers to the foot of the historic White Pass. Today's visitor will appreciate that present-day management of the railroad has a great sense of the line's history. They have brought together long-term employees who have a deep pride in the line and eagerly share this with passengers.
Conductor. I'm senior conductor on the railroad. There was 4 of those locomotives built. The first one was built in 1938. It was a 70. And then the 71 followed, the 72 followed, and the 73 was the last one bought. And it was built by Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia. And the 73 was, like I said, was the last engine. That was bought in 1947. And the 73 is the most modern narrow gauge steam locomotive that was built by Baldwin at that time. It's what they call a Mikado type locomotive. It has an articulated frame, which means that the frame is made to go around the curves. It's pliable. It's a superheated unit. The boiler pressure in it is 210 pounds. It pops at 210 pounds. It seats at 205 pounds. The working pressure is 200 pounds per square inch in the boiler. It has a multiple throttle. And incidentally, that locomotive was not, when it was not built for coal. It was not a coal burner. It was an oil burner because they converted their other locomotives between 47 and 48 to oil. And so this engine was designed without the grates for burning coal. We have a car here on this railroad. Right now it's being replenished in the shops. It was built I think it was built in 1938. It's the first steel parlor car that was built for this railroad, and it was built down in Seattle, Washington, at a welding shop. Apprentice welders were the ones that put it together. And the reason why we call it the Queen's car is because when Queen Elizabeth came to Canada in the 50s, she came to Whitehorse, and she rode the White Pass train from Whitehorse to McRae, which is about 1.5 miles, and she rode in that particular car. And since then, we've called it the Queen's car. But it is the first all-steel passenger car that the railroad owns.
My name is Steve Heitz. I'm manager of passenger operations for White Pass and Yukon route in Skagway, Alaska. The railroad has a rather unique way of getting our passengers, unlike many companies that actually have to pick them up on the dock and bring them into town for the various attractions. White Pass, since 1898, has had railroad line trackage run down right to the waterfront.
For the railroad enthusiast, it's an adventure of a lifetime. Each one of the passenger cars carries a pedigree of exciting times. They were acquired from various rail lines in the United States and Canada, and they are carefully restored and maintained in the shops of the White Pass and Yukon. These are large professional shops, staffed by experienced men who know what it takes to run a railroad in the North. They have custom-built special equipment to handle the job, like this one-of-a-kind narrow-gauge lowboy, used to haul the big cats for snow removal and other maintenance jobs. Currently, there are 2 trips a day during the travel season that originate in Skagway and travel over the White Pass to a point at Fraser, British Columbia, and then return to Skagway. Passengers board the train in Skagway. The historic cars are headed by the steam locomotive number 73. This consist travels to the north of Skagway, where 73 is exchanged for an equally historic set of narrow-gauge diesel engines. They provide the power for the remainder of the trip. On board, in comfortable seating, there is a mile-by-mile narration of the historic facts of the trip. Suddenly, you find yourself reliving the experience of the gold seeker and develop a new appreciation for those hardy men who built this railroad in the hardship of a northern winter.
First car is just now coming along the Gold Rush Cemetery on the right.
At turnaround time, you find yourself wishing that the trip could continue beyond today's service. Back in time, along the shores of Lake Bennett to Carcross, where the old turntable bridge is still in place, waiting to serve the trains and boats, and on to Whitehorse beside the Yukon River, where those ancient stern-wheelers wait for a vicarious trip to Dawson and the promise of gold. And Skagway, it too is dreaming of gold and the historic past. The National Park Service has established the Klondike Gold Rush National Historic Park. This 4-unit national park features Skagway's historic Broadway section as one of the units. The White Pass and Yukon Route Depot now serves as the visitor center for the park. The National Park Service is carefully guiding the restoration of major historic structures. Interesting tours and lectures are available each day of the travel season. Visitors arrive in Skagway's historic port by cruise ship, Alaska Marine Highway, and the Klondike Highway, to enjoy the many events featuring the Klondike Gold Rush, and to ride the White Pass and Yukon route to high adventure.